My new husband believed his son, who accused my son of their girlfriend, which led to his, and I never imagined that marrying Mark would completely shatter my life. When I met him, he seemed like a good man, steady, reliable, and deeply devoted to his only son, Jason. I had been widowed for 4 years, raising my son, Tyler, on my own, trying my best to be both parents at once. When Mark came into my life, he was warm, supportive, and eager to blend our families together. I thought he would be a strong father figure for Tyler, someone who could provide stability and guidance. I thought we could be happy together. But looking back now, I see all the cracks I ignored, all the red flags I brushed aside because I was desperate to believe in love again. Tyler and I moved into Mark's house in the fall, just before school started. It was a quiet little town in northern Michigan, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where high school football games were the biggest event of the week, and where rumors spread faster than wildfire. I thought it would be a fresh start for us, a new home, a new family, a new life where Tyler wouldn't feel so alone anymore. But from the very beginning, things felt off. Jason, Mark's son, was nothing like Tyler. While Tyler was quiet, studious, and introverted, Jason was loud, charming, and always the center of attention. He was the type of boy people gravitated toward, confident, athletic, and effortlessly popular. He had been the town's golden boy for as long as he had been old enough to throw a football, and people treated him like he could do no wrong. Teachers adored him, parents praised him, and girls followed him around like he was some kind of celebrity. Tyler, on the other hand, never cared about popularity. He preferred books over sports, spent his weekends playing video games instead of going to parties, and only had a small circle of friends. He wasn't antisocial, just selective. He never needed to be the center of attention, and he was content with the quiet life we had built together. But moving into Mark's house changed everything. From the moment we got there, Jason made it clear that Tyler was an outsider. He mocked the way he dressed, called him a nerd in front of his friends, and made fun of the way he spoke. It was subtle at first, just little jabs and sarcastic remarks, but over time, it became worse. Tyler tried to ignore it, but I could see the way it wore him down. He would come home from school quieter than usual, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself smaller. When I asked him if everything was okay, he would just shrug and tell me he was fine. I wanted to believe him, but I could feel the distance growing between us. I could feel something dark creeping into our lives, something I didn't yet understand. Then came Emily. She was Jason's girlfriend, beautiful, smart, and well-liked by everyone. She was the kind of girl who seemed too good to be true, the type that could have dated anyone she wanted, yet somehow, she had chosen Jason. They had been together for almost 2 years, but their relationship had always been rocky. Jason was possessive, jealous, and quick to anger, though he hid it well from most people. But Tyler saw through him. Emily and Tyler had known each other for a while, mostly through school, but they weren't particularly close until they were paired together for a group project in one of their classes. They started spending time together, meeting at the library after school, talking about books and movies, and sharing inside jokes. It was harmless, just two classmates working on an assignment, but Jason saw it differently. One night, after Tyler came home late from the library, Jason cornered him in the kitchen. I overheard their voices from the other room, the tension in their words making my stomach twist into knots. "Stay the hell away from Emily," Jason warned, his voice low and threatening. Tyler, never one for confrontation, tried to de-escalate. "We're just working on a project, Jason. It's not a big deal." Jason laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You really think she'd ever want someone like you? You think she talks to you because she likes you? She feels sorry for you. That's it. You're a joke." I stepped into the room before it could go any further, but the damage had already been done. Tyler looked humiliated, his face red with anger and embarrassment, while Jason stood there with that smug grin, knowing he had won. I should have seen it then. I should have known that Jason wasn't just cruel, he was dangerous. A week later, everything fell apart. Emily showed up at school one morning, visibly shaken, her makeup smudged, her hands trembling. She went straight to the principal's office, and within hours, the entire town knew the story. She had been raped, and she claimed that Tyler was the one who did it. The second the words reached me, my entire body went numb. It didn't make sense. It wasn't possible. Tyler could never do something like that. I knew my son. I knew his heart, his soul, his kindness. He wasn't capable of violence, of cruelty, of something so monstrous. But the town didn't care about the truth. They only cared about the story, about the scandal, about the tragedy of it all. Mark believed Jason without hesitation. He told me I needed to accept the facts, that Emily had no reason to lie, that the evidence was overwhelming. He looked at me like I was a fool for defending my own son, as if loving Tyler made me blind to reality. I wanted to scream at him, to shake him, to make him see reason. But no one wanted to listen. Not the town, not the school, not the police. They had already decided who the villain was. The moment Emily accused Tyler, everything in our lives shattered beyond recognition. It didn't matter that there was no physical evidence against him, no witnesses, no real proof. Just her word, Jason's word, and the weight of their reputations against my sons. The town didn't need facts or investigations. They had already decided that Tyler was guilty the second Emily's accusation left her lips. It spread like wildfire through the school, then through the town, and soon even strangers were talking about my son like they had known him their entire lives. I never thought I would have to watch people turn on my child with such viciousness, but it happened faster than I could have imagined. Parents I had known for years suddenly refused to make eye contact with me at the grocery store, whispering behind their hands as I passed by. Tyler's teachers, the same ones who used to praise his intelligence and dedication, now looked at him like he was a monster wearing human skin. The only friend who stuck by him was Logan, a boy who had been at his side since elementary school. But even his loyalty came with consequences. People started calling him the rapist's best friend, like that was something they could just casually throw around in conversation. When the school called to inform me that Tyler was suspended indefinitely, I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. The principal spoke to me in that forced, neutral tone that people use when they want to sound professional but have already made up their minds. He said Tyler wouldn't be allowed back until further notice, that they had to take precautionary measures for the safety of the student body. I wanted to ask him if that was really the reason, or if it was because the school didn't want the bad press, didn't want to be accused of protecting a student that half the town now wanted locked up. But I knew it didn't matter what I said. They had made their decision, just like everyone else. Tyler didn't say much when I picked him up from school that day. He just sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. The silence was heavier than anything I had ever felt before, thick and suffocating, filling the space between us like a living thing. I wanted to reach for him, to tell him that we would fight this, that I believed in him no matter what, but I didn't know if any words could touch the kind of pain he was feeling. I didn't do it, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, like he was afraid that even the air around us might turn against him. I know. I told him, my hands tightening on the steering wheel as I swallowed the lump in my throat. I never doubted you for a second. He nodded, but he didn't look at me. His face was pale, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might break. They're never going to believe me, he said after a moment, his voice cracking just enough to make my chest ache. No matter what I say, no matter what I do, they're always going to think I did it. I wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that we would prove his innocence, that the truth always comes out in the end. But looking at him, at the way his body was shaking with barely restrained emotion, I realized how hollow those words would sound. Because deep down, we both knew the truth didn't matter to people who had already decided they didn't need it. Mark barely looked at Tyler when we got home. He had always been a man of few words, but now the silence between them was different, cold, final, like he had already erased my son from his life and his mind. I pulled him aside that night after Tyler had locked himself in his room, my voice sharp with barely contained anger as I demanded to know how he could turn on my son so easily. He's not my son, Natalie, he said, his voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. Jason is my son, and I believe him. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to demand to know how he could say something like that when he had known Tyler for years. He had sat across from him at the dinner table, asked about his grades, given him advice about college. How could he throw all of that away without a second thought? You don't believe him, I said, my voice shaking with the force of my anger. You believe Jason, because it's easier than accepting the truth. Mark's expression darkened, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. And what truth is that? He asked, his voice sharp with warning. That Jason did it. I spat, no longer willing to tiptoe around what I knew in my gut. You don't want to believe that your son could be capable of something like this, so you'd rather destroy mine instead. He scoffed, shaking his head like I was saying something ridiculous, but I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. It was there for just a second before he forced it away, but I saw it. You're blinded by your love for him, he said, his voice quieter now, like he was trying to convince himself more than me. You can't see what's right in front of you. Neither can you. I snapped, stepping closer, my heart pounding. But the difference is, I'm willing to see the truth, no matter how painful it is. He didn't say anything after that. He just turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with my rage and my grief, knowing in that moment that I would never look at him the same way again. That night, someone spray-painted the word rapist in giant, red letters across our garage door. I woke up to the sound of Logan pounding on our front door, his face pale and panicked as he motioned toward the vandalism, his voice tight, with barely restrained fury. You need to call the cops, he said, his hands shaking as he ran them through his hair. This is getting out of control. I did call the cops, but they didn't seem to care. The officer who arrived barely looked at the damage before shrugging and telling me that there wasn't much they could do. Probably just some kids pulling a prank, he said, his tone so dismissive it made my skin crawl. You should probably think about moving, ma'am. People around here don't take kindly to this sort of thing. I wanted to scream at him, to demand to know if this was what justice looked like in this town, turning a blind eye to violence as long as it was directed at the right people. But I didn't, because I knew it wouldn't change anything. When I went back inside, Tyler was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his hands, his face blank in a way that made my stomach twist painfully. I don't think I can do this anymore, he said, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. My entire body went cold, a deep, suffocating fear creeping into my bones as I sat down across from him, reaching for his hands. Tyler, I said, my voice trembling, you don't have to go through this alone. We'll fight this. I promise you, we will fight this. He didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't meet mine. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized that my son was slipping away from me, and I didn't know how to stop it. Tyler stopped leaving his room unless it was absolutely necessary, and I watched in real time as my son, my bright, kind-hearted, intelligent boy, faded into something I barely recognized. He barely spoke anymore, barely ate, barely acknowledged my presence when I sat beside him, trying to offer whatever comfort I could. Every time I knocked on his door, he would mumble a quiet, "I'm fine," but his voice was hollow, empty, like he had already decided that nothing I said would change what had been done to him. I wanted to believe that I could fix this, that if I just fought hard enough, just held on long enough, I could pull him back from whatever darkness he was sinking into. But every day, I felt him slipping further and further away, and no matter how tightly I held on, my grip was never strong enough to stop it. The threats didn't stop, not even after the police came and investigated the vandalism on our garage door. People left notes on our porch with words so vile I had to throw them away before Tyler could see them. I stopped answering unknown numbers because I was tired of hearing the heavy breathing on the other end of the line, the anonymous voices that whispered, "We know what he did," or, "People like him don't deserve to walk free." Someone threw a rock through our front window in the middle of the night, shattering the glass all over the living room floor, the cold air rushing in like an open wound. Mark barely reacted when I told him about it the next morning, just muttered something about how people had a right to be angry, how maybe we should think about moving somewhere else if this town wasn't safe for us anymore. I wanted to scream at him, wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him until he finally understood that this wasn't just a misunderstanding, that this wasn't just people being angry. This was a goddamn witch hunt, and he was standing on the sidelines, watching it happen like it wasn't his responsibility to do something about it. But I didn't bother, because I already knew what he would say. He had made his choice the second he decided Jason's word meant more to him than mine, more to him than the son I had raised alone for 17 years. The final straw came when Tyler returned to school after weeks of being suspended, hoping, naively, that he could just keep his head down and make it through the last few months before graduation. He didn't even make it past the first period before someone shoved him into a locker so hard he fell to the ground, his books scattering across the hallway floor. No teacher stepped in, no students offered to help him up. Jason stood at the end of the hallway, his arms crossed over his chest, a slow smirk spreading across his face as Tyler scrambled to gather his things with shaking hands. I wasn't there when it happened, but Logan was. He told me everything later that night, his voice shaking with barely contained rage, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. I tried to help him, but he wouldn't let me, Logan said, his voice thick with frustration and guilt. He just got up and walked away like it didn't even matter. But I knew it did matter. I knew it was eating him alive from the inside, that every whisper, every glare, every shove and insult and cruel, vicious word was breaking him apart piece by piece. I should have pulled him out of that school the second the accusation was made, should have packed our bags and left that town behind before it had the chance to devour him whole. But I didn't, because I thought, stupidly, that we could fight this. I thought that if we just held on long enough, people would see the truth, that Jason's lies would unravel, that justice would win in the end. But justice didn't win. Jason did. It was a Friday night when everything fell apart for good, when I walked upstairs to check on Tyler and found his bedroom door slightly open, the soft glow of his desk lamp spilling into the hallway. I knocked once, twice, waiting for his usual tired response, but it never came. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, my stomach twisting itself into knots as I pushed the door open all the way. And then I saw him. I think, deep down, I knew the second I stepped into that room. I knew before my brain could fully process what I was seeing, before my body could register the cold, suffocating horror that settled over me like a thick, unrelenting fog. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, his body still, his head tilted slightly downward, his hands resting in his lap, like he had simply fallen asleep sitting up. But the belt around his neck told a different story, the deep bruising along his throat a silent, undeniable truth that sent me crashing to my knees before I could even reach him. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because Mark came running up the stairs seconds later, his face draining of color the moment he saw what I was cradling in my arms. I was shaking him, sobbing, begging him to wake up, my fingers pressing against his cold skin, his lifeless hands, his arms that once held onto me so tightly as a child, but now dangled uselessly at his sides. Mark tried to pull me away, tried to tell me I had to let go, but I couldn't. I couldn't let go, not of my son, not of the boy I had raised, not of the only thing in this world that had ever truly belonged to me. The paramedics arrived too late, but I knew before they even walked through the door that they couldn't save him. There was no saving someone who had already decided there was nothing left to be saved. The days after were a blur of condolences I didn't want, of whispers that made me sick, of funeral arrangements that felt more like a punishment than a farewell. People who had once called my son a monster suddenly changed their tune, suddenly wanted to act like they had always believed in him, that this was some great, tragic misunderstanding. But I knew the truth. I knew that every person who had turned their back on him had helped put him in that casket. And Jason had the audacity to show up at the funeral, standing in the back of the church with his father, his expression carefully blank, his eyes dark and unreadable. I wanted to scream at him, to tear him apart with my bare hands, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he had inflicted on my son. But I didn't, because I knew that's what he wanted. He wanted to see me break, wanted to watch me crumble under the weight of my grief, wanted to know that he had won. But I wasn't broken. I wasn't defeated. I wasn't done. Because if the town thought Tyler's death would make me give up, if Jason thought he would get to walk away from this without consequences, if Mark thought I would ever forgive him for what he had done, They were all about to find out just how wrong they were. The day after Tyler's funeral, I woke up feeling like my body didn't belong to me anymore, like I had been hollowed out and replaced with something raw, something cold, something unrecognizable. The house was too quiet, too still, too unbearably empty, and every time I passed his bedroom door, I had to fight the instinct to knock, to call out his name, to pretend for just a moment that maybe this had all been a terrible dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. And no matter how many times I begged the universe to rewind time, to give me even one last chance to save him, the universe didn't care. Mark barely spoke to me after the funeral, which was just as well, because I didn't think I could stomach the sound of his voice without wanting to tear him apart. He moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding me whenever possible, burying himself in his work as if pretending that nothing had happened would somehow make it true. I wanted to ask him if he still thought Jason was innocent, if he still believed every lie that came out of his son's mouth, if he had even the slightest bit of doubt now that Tyler was dead. But I didn't ask, because I already knew the answer. I spent the next few days in a haze, going through the motions of a life that no longer felt like it belonged to me, answering phone calls I didn't care about, thanking people for their empty condolences, listening to the same meaningless words over and over again. "I'm so sorry for your loss. He was such a good kid. If there's anything you need, please let me know." Lies. All of it. Because where had these people been when my son was still alive, when he needed someone, anyone, to believe in him? Where was all this sympathy when he was being tormented, when people were throwing rocks through our windows, when they were whispering in the hallways about how he deserved to rot in prison? I wanted to scream at them, wanted to tell them that their apologies meant nothing, that they were just as responsible as Jason was, that every single person who had turned their back on Tyler had helped put him in the ground. But I didn't, because there was no point. Nothing I said would bring my son back, and no amount of guilt could change the fact that it was too late. But it wasn't too late for Jason. The first crack in his perfect little story came from Emily. I don't know if it was guilt, or fear, or just the weight of everything finally collapsing on top of her. But a week after Tyler's funeral, she walked into the school counselor's office and told the truth. I didn't hear about it until later, when Detective Reed knocked on my door, his face unreadable as he asked if he could come inside. I hadn't spoken to him since Tyler's death, hadn't wanted to see his face, hadn't wanted to hear whatever bullshit excuse he would try to feed me about how sorry he was, about how this wasn't what he wanted, about how he had just been doing his job. But something in his expression made me step aside. Something in the way his jaw was clenched and his hands were curled into fists at his sides, like he was barely holding himself together, made me let him in. "She recanted," he said, without preamble, without hesitation, without any of the usual cautious, careful phrasing that cops always used when they were trying to soften the truth. Emily told the counselor that Tyler didn't touch her, that she lied because Jason told her to, that she was scared of what he would do if she didn't go along with it. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except stare at him and let the words sink in. I had dreamed of this moment so many times, had imagined 1,000 different ways the truth might finally come out, had spent countless sleepless nights picturing the look on Jason's face when the world finally saw him for what he really was. But now that it was actually happening, now that the words had been spoken aloud, I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel anything except the cold, gnawing realization that none of this mattered anymore. My son was dead, and no amount of truth could ever change that. I don't remember much of what Reed said after that. Don't remember the exact moment he told me that Jason had been taken into custody, that charges were being filed, that there was an overwhelming amount of evidence now that Emily had come forward. I only remember standing there, my arms wrapped tightly around myself, my nails digging into my skin so hard I thought I might draw blood, and thinking about how much Tyler would have wanted to hear those words. But he would never hear them, because Jason had taken that from him. Mark left that night, packing a bag without a word, his face pale and drawn, his shoulders slumped like he had aged 10 years in the span of a single afternoon. I didn't try to stop him, didn't ask him where he was going, didn't care if he ever came back. He didn't apologize. He didn't say I was right. He didn't say anything at all. And honestly, what could he have said that would have mattered? I sat on the couch after he left, staring at the blank television screen, my mind replaying every conversation, every argument, every moment where I had tried to make him see the truth. And I realized, with a clarity that made my stomach turn, that he had never really wanted to see it at all. Because believing Jason was easier. Because facing the truth meant facing his own failure as a father. Because, deep down, I think he always knew. The trial was fast. Jason's lawyers tried to argue that he was just a kid, that he had made a mistake, that he didn't deserve to have his life ruined over one bad decision. I wanted to laugh in their faces, wanted to ask them if they had told Tyler the same thing when they branded him a rapist and left him to die. But I didn't say anything. I just sat in the courtroom, listening to them twist the truth, listening to them try to paint Jason as a misunderstood teenager instead of the monster he was. Emily testified against him. So did Logan. So did several other girls who finally found the courage to come forward, admitting that Jason had hurt them too, that he had threatened them, that he had used his father's influence to get away with it for years. He was sentenced to 15 years. Not long enough. Not nearly long enough. After it was over, people started talking about Tyler differently, started calling him a tragedy instead of a criminal, started saying how awful it was that he had been taken too soon. They built a memorial for him at the school, dedicated a bench in his honor, wrote articles about how the system had failed him. But it was all too little, too late, and every time I saw his name carved into that stone, all I could think about was how none of it would have mattered to him. He didn't want a memorial. He just wanted to be believed. And now, when it finally mattered, he wasn't here to see it. I sat in the back of the courtroom the day Jason was sentenced, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap that my nails left crescent-shaped indentations in my skin. The judge's voice was calm, detached, almost clinical as he read out the final verdict, but none of it felt real to me. The words should have meant something. The guilty verdict should have felt like a victory, should have brought me some sense of closure, some satisfaction that justice had finally been served. But all I felt was the unbearable weight of everything that had come before this moment, the suffocating emptiness of knowing that none of it would bring Tyler back. Jason sat motionless as the sentence was read, his expression unreadable, his hands folded neatly on the table in front of him like he was sitting through a boring lecture rather than the moment his entire life changed forever. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. Even when the bailiffs moved in to escort him from the courtroom, he kept his eyes straight ahead, never once acknowledging the people he had destroyed, the lives he had shattered with his lies. Mark was there, standing near the door with his arms crossed over his chest, his face pale and drawn, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might snap. I hadn't spoken to him since the night he left, hadn't answered his calls, hadn't acknowledged the pathetic, half-hearted attempts he had made to explain himself. He had tried to tell me that he didn't know, that he had never wanted any of this, that he had just wanted to believe his son because the alternative was too horrifying to consider. But I didn't care what he had wanted to believe, because the truth was simple. He had chosen Jason over Tyler, and because of that choice, my son was dead. After the sentencing, people started coming up to me, offering their condolences, telling me how brave I was, how strong I had been through all of this, how they couldn't imagine the pain I must be feeling. I wanted to scream at them, to ask them where this sympathy had been when Tyler was still alive, to demand to know why it took his death for them to suddenly care about the truth. But I just nodded, murmured my thanks, and walked past them, because none of it mattered anymore. Logan found me outside the courthouse, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket, his shoulders tense, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. He had been the only person who had stood by Tyler through everything, the only person who had refused to turn his back on him when the rest of the world had decided he wasn't worth saving. I owed him more than I could ever repay, and yet, looking at him now, I knew that he blamed himself just as much as I did. "You okay?" he asked, his voice rough, hesitant, like he already knew the answer. I let out a slow breath, staring out at the gray sky above us, the heavy clouds pressing down like a weight on my chest. "I don't think I'll ever be okay again," I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But it's over now. Logan shook his head, his jaw tightening as he looked away. "It's not over," he said, his voice thick with barely contained emotion. "It'll never be over. Not for you. Not for me. Not for Tyler." He was right, of course. There was no real ending to this story. No perfect resolution that would make everything okay again. No moment where I would suddenly wake up and feel whole. Tyler was gone, and Jason was in prison, and the world would keep spinning just like it always had, completely indifferent to the lives it had destroyed along the way. A week after the sentencing, I packed up what little I cared to take with me and left that town behind, because I knew if I stayed, it would swallow me whole. Every street, every building, every whispered conversation in the grocery store would be a reminder of what had happened, of what I had lost, of the battle I had fought and won far too late. There was nothing left for me there, nothing except ghosts and regrets, and the unbearable silence of a house that would never feel like home again. Mark didn't try to stop me. I don't even think he was surprised. I left behind everything that had tied me to that place. Our house, our neighbors, the people who had turned their backs on my son when he needed them the most. But I didn't leave behind the truth, because the truth was the only thing I had left. I made sure people knew what had happened. I told Tyler's story to anyone who would listen. I wrote articles, gave interviews, made sure that his name wouldn't just become another forgotten tragedy in a world that moved on far too quickly. I wanted people to remember. I needed them to remember. And if nothing else, I would make sure that Jason, no matter how many years passed, no matter how much time he served, would never be able to forget.